Living alone in my small apartment in a quiet part of town, I thought I'd found the perfect place. It was affordable, close to work, and peaceful. I loved the idea of coming home to a space all my own, unwinding after a long day. But recently, things felt off. There was nothing clear at first, just these small, uneasy feelings, like I was being watched whenever I crossed the living room or stood near the window. One night, as I was about to close my curtains, I glanced over at the building across from me. There he was, a man, maybe in his late 40s, sitting by his window, looking right at me. I brushed it off as a coincidence, a one-time thing. Maybe he was lost in thought and happened to be facing my way. But over the next few days, he was always there, sitting by his window each evening, looking in my direction. Even when I tried to ignore it, his gaze made my skin crawl. As days turned into weeks, he became part of my routine. I'd catch a glimpse of him, sometimes turning away if I looked too directly, but he was always there, in my periphery. A voice in my head kept trying to rationalize it. It's nothing, just some lonely guy with time on his hands. But the unease didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, like a quiet buzz under my skin, building with each day that passed. I began to change how I moved around my apartment, especially in the evenings. I'd sit out of view in the living room and avoid cooking by the kitchen window. If I was in my bedroom, I'd leave the door open, hoping I'd hear if anyone approached. It felt silly, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his staring wasn't just curiosity. Strangely, I'd never seen him outside. Most neighbors passed by at some point, picking up mail or heading to work, but not him. It was as if he only existed at that window. And yet, each time I saw him, I felt like he was somehow closer, even though he was clearly sitting in the same spot. The tension was there, growing, making me uneasy in my own home. One evening, as I went to close my curtains, I looked across and saw him, holding binoculars. He had them up to his eyes, pointed right at me. My chest tightened, and I dropped the curtain, my heart pounding. I backed away from the window, wondering what he'd seen. I spent the next few days on edge, constantly glancing at his window even when I wasn't near mine. My paranoia seemed to be winning, and I hated it. But those binoculars had changed things. It was no longer just a man watching from afar. It felt invasive. Every small noise made me jump, and I kept checking the locks on my doors and windows. Then one evening, as I reached for my keys outside my door, I noticed something strange. The small potted plant I kept outside was gone. It wasn't valuable or unique, just a tiny succulent. I thought maybe someone had knocked it over or taken it as a prank, but the thought of him, the man across the way, crossed my mind. I quickly dismissed it as ridiculous. But a few days later, my gloves disappeared. I'd left them on my balcony, and in the morning, they were gone. No plant, no gloves. This was too much to ignore. My mind kept going back to his binoculars and that intense, deliberate stare. A quiet paranoia started seeping into everything I did. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stand the thought of him watching, stealing little things, and getting away with it. So, I decided to confront him. It was a snap decision, but I couldn't keep living in fear. I crossed the hall to his apartment, my heart pounding as I raised my fist to knock. The hallway felt colder, quieter than usual, as if the building was holding its breath. I thought about what I'd say, rehearsing words in my head, hoping to sound assertive and not terrified. After what felt like forever, he opened the door. He stood there, calm, with an almost welcoming look. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, he smiled. A small, knowing smile that made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice disturbingly smooth. I took a steadying breath. "I noticed you've been watching me," I managed, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "It's making me uncomfortable, and some of my things have gone missing." He didn't deny it, didn't even blink. Instead, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Missing things, you say?" His eyebrow lifted, with a hint of amusement. I wouldn't know anything about that, but I am curious. What else have you noticed? The way he said it made my stomach twist. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn around and never look back, but I couldn't just walk away. I needed him to know I wasn't afraid, or at least pretend I wasn't. I just want you to stop. Whatever it is you're doing, it's not okay. He nodded, as if I'd made a mundane request. Of course, he replied, his smile widening. If that's what you want. I hurried back to my apartment, but the way he looked at me stayed with me, crawling under my skin. I couldn't shake that encounter. His smile, the way he looked at me, none of it left my mind after I'd locked myself back in my apartment. But I needed answers. I wanted control over my own life again, and fear had started turning into determination. One evening, I watched his apartment until I was sure he'd left. Then I made my way over. I wasn't going to confront him this time. I was going to find out what he was hiding. I told myself it would be quick, just a glance around, then I'd leave. My hands shook as I turned his doorknob, hoping it was unlocked, and to my surprise, it twisted easily. I slipped inside and closed the door quietly behind me. The silence was thick, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself forward. The apartment was dark, and a stale, suffocating smell lingered, like the place hadn't been aired out in weeks. I walked down a narrow hallway until I saw a door slightly open, a faint light seeping from the crack. Heart pounding, I pushed it open and froze. The room was filled with photos, dozens of them, all of me. Some were of me walking to my car, others of me at my window, and a few from inside my own apartment. A chill ran down my spine as I recognized the small potted plant he'd taken in my gloves, sitting on a table like trophies in some sick collection. Then I saw a notebook with my name on it. I picked it up, flipping through pages detailing my routines, habits, everything about me. It felt like he was planning something horrible, and I was his target. I was so lost in horror that I didn't hear the footsteps until they were right outside the door. My breath caught, and I clutched the notebook, heart hammering as the doorknob slowly turned. I backed up, looking frantically for another way out, but there was nowhere to go. I heard the door creak open, and before I could react, I shoved myself under a table, hoping he wouldn't see me. Seconds stretched into eternity as he entered the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. From beneath the table, I watched as he scanned the room, his gaze stopping on the table where I'd left the notebook. His expression darkened as he flipped through the pages, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look down. Finally, he turned and left, closing the door behind him. I waited until his footsteps faded, then crawled out, my whole body shaking. Without another thought, I bolted out of his apartment and sprinted into the night. Back at my place, I locked the door and collapsed, gasping for air. I couldn't believe what I'd seen. I left that same night, moving across town. But even now, whenever I pass a window, I feel his eyes on me. And a few weeks later, I found a note slipped under my new door with my name on it, written in that same cramped handwriting. When I was a kid, I spent a few years at a boarding school way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods and a dirt road that seemed to lead to nothing. The school shut down suddenly, and we were all sent home without much explanation. I never thought I'd go back, but here I am, standing in front of the abandoned building, with its broken windows and peeling paint, wondering what drew me back here. Something about this place feels darker than I remember. Maybe it's just the years gone by, or my mind playing tricks on me, but each step toward the building makes my breath heavier. The silence is almost deafening, and even before I step inside, I feel like someone's watching me. It's a feeling I've never liked to admit. I force myself forward, convincing myself it's just old memories, and that this building can't scare me anymore. The moment I cross the entrance, the smell of mold and old wood hits me, bringing back memories I thought I'd forgotten. I try to focus, but there's a strange tension in the air. Walking through the entrance hall, Everything seems frozen in time. Stacked chairs, closed doors, and the same worn-out floors. It's not exactly scary yet, but unsettling. There's an odd energy, almost as if the place has been waiting for me. As I continue down the main hallway, each step echoes against the walls, making me remember the stories that used to float around between the students. I never knew if they were just rumors, but I remember classmates who disappeared without a trace, just going home one day and never coming back. At the time, the teachers said they'd moved away, but we whispered a different story among ourselves, that they'd been taken to some special wing of the school, a place only the staff knew about. I passed by old classrooms, each with desks covered in dust and chalkboards with faint traces of old lessons still on them. I stop at one door and feel a chill run through me as I try to remember what it used to hold. I try to convince myself that the unease is just nostalgia, but deep down, part of me can't shake the rumors about secret experiments on students, stories that felt too scary to believe back then. I take a step forward and stand in front of a specific room, feeling an odd familiarity. The silence grows heavy, almost as if the building itself is watching me, waiting for me to step inside and uncover what really happened. I walked a bit further, trying to keep my cool. Part of me was curious, but a much stronger part wanted me to turn back and leave. Still, it wasn't that easy to walk away after finally deciding to confront this place. As I moved through the corridors, my eyes landed on a door at the end of the hall, reinforced with a large, rusty lock that I didn't remember seeing before. Curious, I forced the handle, which gave way after a bit of effort. The door creaked open, and I stepped in, lighting the room with my phone's flashlight. The space looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Papers and clipboards were scattered on the floor, with shelves holding empty jars and file folders. In the center of the room, I found old photos and student files, each with a black and white photo attached. Most of the faces didn't ring a bell, but a few looked strangely familiar. For a moment, I wondered if I was just pulling memories from thin air, but a growing sense of dread told me otherwise. Why had this room been hidden and locked up? As I skimmed through the papers, one file in particular caught my attention. The name belonged to a classmate who had disappeared. I stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to face. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but something told me I was about to find out. As soon as I stepped out of that room, something in the hallway felt different. It was darker than before, and an oppressive silence hung in the air. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of old lockers lined up against the wall. I took a deep breath and kept walking, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the footsteps continued, like a faint echo that seemed to match my own movements. I quickened my pace and rounded the corner, only to stop dead in my tracks. All the doors along the hallway were now open, even the ones I was sure I had left closed. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and suddenly, a shelf next to me crashed to the floor with a loud bang, making me jump back. When I looked over at where it had fallen, I noticed a small, almost hidden entryway behind it. Curiosity won over fear. I moved closer, peering inside with caution. Beyond the entryway was a narrow hallway leading to another room. I hesitated but felt an inexplicable pull to continue. I stepped inside, knowing I might be getting myself into something I couldn't handle. As I entered the new room, a chill washed over me. This space was different from the others, darker, filled with old furniture and medical equipment covered in a thick layer of dust. At the far end of the room, I saw jars with cloudy liquids and faded labels, some containing what looked like preserved samples. My mind started piecing together what might have happened here, but I didn't want to believe it. I started examining the shelves, feeling both disgusted and strangely drawn to what I was finding. Among the papers were diagrams, notes on experiments, and even files on students, listing their ages, heights, and other details. Each file seemed more disturbing than the last, and a horrifying pattern emerged. The ages of the students matched those of my classmates, the ones who had moved away suddenly. The ones who, I now realized, might never have left this place. Then I heard footsteps. This time, they were close, not distant echoes, but right there in the room. Panic surged through me, and I ducked behind a table, struggling to stay calm. I peeked over the edge and saw a figure moving through the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but the way it moved, slow and unnatural, made it clear that whoever, or whatever, it was didn't want me here. My heart pounded as the figure wandered around the lab. The sense of danger was overwhelming, but I knew I had to get out without being noticed. I waited for the right moment, held my breath, and took a step back, praying I wouldn't make a sound. It felt like one wrong move would be the end. After what felt like an eternity, the figure drifted out into the hallway. I seized my chance, slipping out of the room as quietly as I could. Once I hit the main corridor, I bolted for the exit. Each step felt risky, but the need to escape outweighed the fear. When I finally burst through the front doors and into the open air, the pressure in my chest eased slightly, but the horror of what I'd seen stayed lodged in my mind. Even after leaving the school behind, the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. At home, the echoes of that place continued to haunt me. Night after night, I was plagued by nightmares of the lab, the student files, and that shadowy figure that had roamed the halls. The memories lingered, leaving me marked, unable to shake the sense that whatever haunted that place might still be watching me, making me doubt if I truly left that horror behind. The rain was relentless, pouring down like a solid wall of water as I hurried down the empty street. My backpack was soaked through, and every step felt heavier with the weight of the rain. There was hardly anyone around. The streets seemed abandoned, and the dim, flickering streetlights only added to the eerie atmosphere. I couldn't help but feel a slight unease, like maybe I wasn't alone, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild on a cold, wet night. Just as I rounded the corner, a white van pulled up alongside me, slowing down as the driver rolled down his window. A man, probably in his mid-40s, with thinning hair and a friendly enough face, leaned over from the driver's seat. "Hey there," he called out, raising his voice over the sound of the rain. "Need a lift? This weather is brutal." I hesitated. My mom always warned me about taking rides from strangers, but the rain was coming down so hard I was starting to shiver. I looked up and down the deserted street, and after a second's thought, I nodded. Maybe I was being overly cautious, I told myself. After all, he seemed normal enough, and what were the odds of something going wrong? I climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me, grateful to be out of the downpour. The van's interior was warm but had a faint, stale smell that I couldn't quite place. As I settled in, I glanced around and noticed a few odd things. A small, worn-out teddy bear on the dashboard and some faded stickers on the glove compartment that looked like they'd been there for years. Nothing alarming, but a little out of place. The driver gave me a quick smile, and I forced myself to relax, telling myself that everything was fine. The van started moving, and I glanced out the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. After a few minutes of silence, I tried to make small talk. "So, do you usually drive around giving people rides in the rain?" I asked, with a bit of a nervous laugh. He shrugged, barely looking over. "Sometimes. Helps pass the time." His response was short, almost dismissive, but I brushed it off. I kept my gaze on the road, trying to follow where we were going. At first, the streets looked familiar, but then I started noticing that we were heading in the opposite direction of my neighborhood. I cleared my throat, feeling a slight twinge of discomfort. I think my place is the other way?" The driver gave a small smile, glancing at me briefly before looking back at the road. "Relax. I know a shortcut. It'll get you there faster. Trust me." I shifted in my seat, suddenly more alert. Something about the way he said that put me on edge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he really did know a better way, or maybe I was just being paranoid. But as we drove farther, The streets became less familiar, and my unease grew. I gripped my phone tightly, trying to focus on anything but the creeping fear. As we kept going, I started to feel trapped. The van was moving further and further away from any area I recognized, and each turn seemed to pull us deeper into an empty part of town. My mind raced, trying to calm myself down. Maybe he was just a weird guy trying to help out, right? But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I decided to open the window a crack, just to get some fresh air and clear my head. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Confused, I tried again, using a little more force, but it was locked tight. Then, I glanced over and noticed something I hadn't before. Each window was covered with a thin layer of metal on the outside. I couldn't see out, and now I realized no one could see in. I felt my heart start to race. I tried to keep my breathing steady as I glanced at the door handle, hoping that maybe I could unlock it and slip out when we stopped at a light. But the door handle didn't work either. Panic started to set in as I realized I was completely trapped. I pulled out my phone, hoping to text my friend or maybe call for help, but there was no signal. The bars on my phone were gone, just a blank screen staring back at me. I could feel the blood drain from my face as the reality of the situation sank in. I was in the middle of nowhere, locked in a stranger's van, with no way to contact anyone. Trying to stay calm, I shifted slightly in my seat, hoping the driver hadn't noticed my distress. The silence in the van was unbearable. Just as I was about to say something, anything to break the tension, the driver spoke up in a low, almost casual voice. "You know, you're not the first passenger I've picked up on nights like this." My stomach twisted at his words. I forced a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, do you do this often?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, you'd be surprised how many people need a ride on a rainy night. Some of them, well, let's just say they didn't enjoy the trip as much as you are." He chuckled to himself, but there was no humor in it, just a cold edge that made my skin crawl. I tried to keep my face neutral, but my mind was racing. What did he mean by that? Was he trying to scare me? Or was this some kind of twisted game he played with his passengers? I swallowed hard, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Well, I'd appreciate it if we could just get to my stop as quickly as possible, but he just smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, don't worry. We're almost there," he replied, his tone laced with something dark that made me shudder. Every instinct in me screamed that I needed to get out, but I was locked in with no way out. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe he was just a strange guy with a bad sense of humor. But the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, the way his fingers tightened around the steering wheel whenever I shifted nervously, it all felt wrong. I knew I couldn't stay in that van another second. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a way to escape, but everything felt so hopeless with the doors locked and the windows covered. I shifted in my seat, hoping I could reach something, anything that might help. And then I spotted it, a tiny, almost hidden latch on the door. It looked old and worn, but I couldn't let the chance slip away. With a quick glance toward the driver, who seemed focused on the dark, winding road ahead, I reached for the latch, trying to be as quiet as possible. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with it, but finally, I felt it give way, and I heard a soft click. My pulse raced. It was my only shot. The van slowed slightly as he prepared to make a turn onto an even darker road. Without another thought, I yanked the door open and threw myself out, hitting the wet pavement hard. Pain shot through my arm and leg as I rolled across the road, feeling the rough asphalt tear at my skin. But I didn't care. I was free, dazed and barely able to think. I pushed myself up, glancing back just long enough to see the van skid to a halt a few yards away. The driver threw open his door, his voice echoing through the rain as he shouted after me. I forced myself to run, every step sending a jolt of pain through my body. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away from him as possible. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the rain, I finally saw lights up ahead. a small gas station on the edge of the road. I ran inside, soaking wet, gasping for breath, and begging the cashier to call the police. The van never showed up, and by the time the police arrived, there was no trace of it or the driver. Days later, after I'd recovered from the bruises and the shock, I couldn't shake the memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that van, those metal-covered windows, and heard his cold, twisted words. Even now, when I walk down the street, I can't help but look over my shoulder, afraid that somewhere out there, he's waiting, just watching for the next passenger to pick up on a rainy night. The road seemed endless, each curve and straight stretch only leading to more miles of nothingness. The night was heavy, the kind of darkness that swallows every trace of light. My exhaustion weighed down on my eyes, and even though I knew I was just an hour away from home, I was at my limit. When I saw that flickering "budget rooms" sign off the side of the road, the temptation was too strong to ignore. I pulled into the empty parking lot, where only 1 or 2 streetlights worked, casting a faint yellow glow over the cracked asphalt. The place looked like it was stuck in time. One of those motels you'd see in old movies. I took a deep breath, convincing myself that one night here was better than risking falling asleep at the wheel. The lobby was even more unsettling than outside. Stepping in gave me chills. The man behind the counter, a pale, thin figure, barely said a word. He just handed me the key, and I took it without a fuss. When he gave me a slight nod, it felt like he knew something I didn't, but I brushed it off. It's just one night, I thought. By morning, I'll be out of here. The room matched the rest of the motel. Old, with worn-out furniture, and that musty smell you can feel clinging to the walls. As I dropped my bag on the floor, I noticed something odd. Across the room, there was a second door. It was old, with peeling paint and a broken lock. For some reason, it bothered me. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong. The feeling was strange, but I brushed it off. I just wanted to rest. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. It was a soft, repetitive sound, like a faint tapping. Half asleep, I tried to ignore it, thinking it could be anything. Maybe the old plumbing or some piece of furniture creaking from age. But the noise kept going, and then I realized it was coming from that second door. I got up slowly, still groggy, and stood near the door, trying to listen. The sound was more subtle than I'd initially thought, but just constant enough to keep me awake. When I pressed my ear to the door, I felt a draft of cold air coming from underneath, almost as if the hallway beyond was breathing. I took a step back, my heart beating a bit faster. That hallway bothered me, but it didn't make sense to be scared. I went back to bed, convincing myself I was overthinking things, that it was just the atmosphere and my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But every time I closed my eyes, the curiosity and discomfort grew stronger. After a few minutes of silence, the noise started again, but this time, it was louder, like something was moving closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The feeling that there was something on the other side of the door was too strong, and curiosity, or maybe a need to understand what was happening, finally won over my fear. I stood up slowly, breathing heavily and feeling my muscles tense. I opened the door just a crack, enough to peek outside. On the other side was a narrow, dark hallway stretching as far as I could see. The lighting was poor, with only a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling, but enough to show that the hallway seemed to connect several rooms like mine, each with their doors slightly open, as if left that way on purpose. I stepped closer to one of the doors and peered inside. It was just like my room. The same bed, the same worn-out furniture, almost like an exact replica. I frowned, feeling uneasy, and my heart beat even faster. But what really unsettled me were the shadows. They moved slowly, as if there was something or someone in the hallway, moving from one room to another. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, as I turned to look further down the hallway, I saw a larger shadow form close by. Someone was there, standing at a distance, watching me. Time seemed to stop as that figure in the hallway stared directly at me. My instinct was to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure didn't move, but there was something deeply unsettling about its empty gaze, an eerie, dull shine in its eyes that froze me in place. Finally, I managed to gather enough strength to slam the door shut and stumble backward, as if that flimsy door could somehow protect me. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart pound against my chest. I had to get out of there. I ran to the main door of the room, but when I tried to open it, I realized it was locked. Panic started to settle in, and the sounds from the hallway grew louder, dragging footsteps, now way closer to my door. I didn't know what to do, trapped between two exits, one locked tight and the other leading directly to whatever was lurking in that hallway. With my breathing erratic, I struggled to come up with an escape plan. I scanned the room, looking for anything that could help me pry open the main door or, at the very least, defend myself. But the room was practically bare, nothing that could be useful. I yanked the main door handle again, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the room itself was determined to keep me inside. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Every sound from the hallway vanished, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. For a moment, I thought maybe it was safe. I walked back toward the second door, opening it just enough to check. The hallway was empty, with no signs of the shadows or that figure that had stared me down before. But this calm only made me feel more uncomfortable. I took a deep breath, determined to make a run for it. I stepped into the hallway, walking slowly and keeping my eyes on each open door around me. The eerie similarity between each room threw me off, like I was trapped in some kind of twisted maze. When I finally found my way to the lobby, I felt a brief moment of relief, until I realized it was completely empty. There was no sign of the attendant who had given me the key. I rushed to the parking lot, got in my car, and turned the ignition, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I looked back one last time. The motel's sign flickered irregularly, almost as if it were trying to send me a message I'd never understand. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that place had left a mark on me. It was like whatever I'd encountered in that hallway had somehow latched on, and I knew that I might never really escape it.